Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here for Shade Gardening with San Francisco Native Plants. I am with the Yerba Buena chapter of the California Native Plant Society, and that is the city and county of San Francisco and the northern part of San Mateo County down to Highway 92. We're going to talk about why plant native plants and then different kinds of native shade plants, the types of shade, deep shade plants, medium shade plants, which is not normally a thing, light shade plant summary, and container plants in shade. We'll talk about native plants, plant buffets, because I am obsessed with food and garden resources. So why plant native plants? Well, our native plants evolved in San Francisco's varied soils and weather. In 7 by 7 miles, we have got 6 kinds of soil. We've got 3 north and south fog and wind banks, and we have an enormous variation in rainfall from month to month and even within months from year to year. Since the 1800s, we have measured as little as 7 inches of rainfall and as much as 50 inches, that's 50, when we get atmospheric rivers. Last year, we had 8 inches of rain, almost the worst rain year in San Francisco's recorded history. It could continue to be bad as climate change pushes us to more extremes. One of the reasons we don't necessarily want to plant plants from Los Angeles is that although they may be fine with the low end of the rainfall, they will not survive the years where we have high rainfall, and we will continue to get those. The atmospheric rivers that hit Napa and Sonoma over the last few years will at some point come back and hit San Francisco. When I moved here from Los Angeles, I did plant some of my favorite native sages, and they promptly keeled over in a good rain year. So we do have native plants to San Francisco that have very long north and south ranges, such as the toyon and coyote bush. And so I strongly recommend, and blue elderberry. So I strongly recommend that if you really want to plant a drought tolerant plant that will be drought tolerant for years to come, but also be able to handle our very high rainfall years, that you consider a locally native plant that's got a wide range. And the other reason we want to plant native plants is because there's an enormous decline in the number of insects. And when we don't have insects, we also don't have birds. Audubon estimates that we are missing almost 3 billion birds because we don't have the caterpillars to feed the baby birds. We've got specialist bees where the baby bees are dependent on our native plant pollen. We've got all of our caterpillars dependent on the plant leaves with which they co-evolved, which are the local native plant leaves. And so that's our butterflies, our moths, and other insects that go through a caterpillar phase. And then all of the birds that depend on having caterpillars to feed their baby birds. So baby birds have very soft throats like human babies, and they can only eat soft food like tofu or hot dogs. And the tofu and hot dogs of the insect world are caterpillars and aphids, and caterpillars are just bigger than aphids. So if a bird parent can't find caterpillars, they're stuck getting a whole bunch of aphids. Doug Taleny is the researcher at the University of Delaware. He and his graduate students are the ones who realized that, oh, hey, wait a minute. Each different plant supports a different number of different caterpillar species. And so they measured the species associated with a variety of different plants and realized that, oh my goodness, the reason we're missing birds is because we're missing caterpillars, and we're missing caterpillars because we're missing native plants. His graduate student estimates that one nest of chickadees requires between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to be fledged. And so we've got to have native plants in our landscape to be able to feed those baby birds. They also measured not only native plants, but also introduced plants, and most introduced plant leaves feed between 0 and 2 caterpillar species. So it's just not enough. We've got to have those native plants to feed the rest of our ecosystem. So interestingly, we had Sam Droege from the US Geological Service. That is the part of the government that is in charge of understanding all of our native bees. We have 1,500 native bee species in California, 1,300 butterfly and moth species. USGS is in charge of all of them. The US Department of Agriculture is in charge of honeybees because they're tiny little cattle, but honeybees are imported from, or were imported from Europe and Asia, and they're not native here. And so if we look at Jared Fowler's compilation of bee pollen use by where adult bees gather that pollen for use by baby bees, we see a completely different plant list than we see for caterpillars. So here's the Jared Fowler compilation. Here are caterpillars, here are baby bees. So bees and caterpillars are that important transition from plants to feeding the rest of our ecosystem. Completely different list. It means that, yes, indeed, you should go out and get every different native plant that will fit into your garden, that is appropriate for your soil and sun and rain and wind, because it could feed an enormous amount of wildlife. And we're just not going to get this kind of service from an introduced plant. Doug Taleny has done not only research, but has written 3 wonderful books for the public, and the latest is Nature's Best Hope. And these are his recommendations to plant local native keystone plants, oaks, willows, and cherries, because each one of those plants feeds over 200 different species of caterpillars for every county in the United States. Plant a variety of native plants, and plant for those specialist pollinators and caterpillars. And be sure to leave some leaves on the ground, because when caterpillars spin a cocoon, it looks like a dead leaf, and so they need someplace to hide so that birds don't find them when they're in the cocoons. Strongly recommend you read his books, or you go listen to the interviews that he did with California Native Plant Society Santa Clara Valley. He did 2 for them, and then 1 with California Native Plant Society State. All of them are on YouTube. He's got a current website, Homegrown National Park, and all of the data for every county in the United States was US Department of Agriculture paid him to collate that data for butterflies and moths, and it's all held on the National Wildlife Federation's website under their Native Plant Finder. So we used to think that we could just stick all of nature, all of our wildlife into parks, and that everything would be fine. Well, it turns out a couple of completely different studies, one by German researchers in multiple German nature preserves, and one in a Puerto Rican nature preserve, showed that no, we're losing a ton of insect, just biomass and biodiversity. So parks are vital, but they're not enough to preserve insects and all of the functions that we need from our ecosystem. Less than 4% of the land in the United States are national parks, state parks, and protected areas. So parks alone are not going to save our ecosystems. San Francisco Estuary Institute is a local research institute, and they did a wonderful report called Making Nature's City. And they determined that even in some place like San Francisco, where 68% of San Francisco is paved, we can still make a difference to our ecosystem when we comply with the following success factors: when we plant native plants, and when we create green corridors as stepping stones between larger green spaces. So the work that the community is doing on Sunset Boulevard, and that Nature in the City is doing with the Green Hair Street corridor. And every one of us, every pot that you've got on a north-facing porch, every home backyard, every school garden, all of these, when we plant native plants, give wildlife a place to stop and get a snack, because they don't have Yelp. They don't know where they're going to be able to fly to find food. So native plants, green corridors, those green patch sizes are important. We do have some wildlife that really need a larger space. We had Jonathan Young speak to CNPS Yerba Buena a few months ago about coyotes Coyotes need a lot of space. Coveys of quail are at least 50 individuals. They need a lot of space. So we do have some wildlife that need a very large space. And then the quality of the green space. So no invasive plants and reducing the introduced non-native plants, reducing our lawn and avoiding pesticides, and then taking very special care of large trees and water and aquifers. That San Francisco Estuary Institute report is Making Nature City is available for free on their website, both in English and in Spanish. Because so much of San Francisco is paved, because there's less than 4% of the plants in San Francisco are native, every plant is an opportunity to feed our ecosystem. So let's talk some shade plants. So another really great project that San Francisco Estuary Institute did is one called Hidden Nature. They did that in conjunction with the Exploratorium. They've got a wonderful map where they did a lot of research, including some public input to figure out where we have our different plant communities in San Francisco, because it's very helpful to plant in plant communities because plants evolved in plant communities. They evolved with different root lengths, and the mycorrhiza fungi that we had J.R. Blair talk with us about to share nutrients to help plants survive and be resilient during drought episodes. We have a ton of different plant communities. We've got oak, woodland, and coastal dune scrub, and dunes and grasslands and riparian areas, which are, riparian is a fancy word for creekside. There's more information available about these on the Hidden Nature website. National Park Service has got some great information from the Presidio. SF Plant Finder from the Department of Environment and Las Felitas all have really good information on plant communities. And we care about plant communities because shade plants evolved in plant communities as understory plants. So let's look at the oak woodland where we've got some very tall trees. We've got the oaks, we've got the big leaf maples, we've got the California bay laurel, and then we start to have shorter and shorter plants. We've got toyons that are still pretty tall, but not as tall as the oaks. And then we get to some shrubs, and then we get to some ground covers. And the farther down we go, the less light those plants got. And so we have plants that evolved as understory plants, and they are naturally shade tolerant, as well as having evolved in our soils and our weather. So they're ready for whatever kind of shady environment you've got in your garden. So I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of shade. Deep shade plants, they don't need any sun. They're fine. They live their whole life cycles without sun. Nice and dark, they don't care. There's something called, that I'm going to call medium shade. It is not a thing. You're not going to find that elsewhere on the internet. What I've seen when I've planted some of those deep shade plants is that some of them need just a few weeks, maybe just a little bit of dappled sunlight or a few weeks of sun, just a little bit in the middle of June to be able to either flower, or if they do flower in deep shade, to fruit. And we'll get to those plants, but all of those plants will be fine. They'll be fine year after year after year in deep shade. They just may not either flower or fruit as you might like that to have them do. And then there's light shade plants. And those are ones that need a little bit of sun and a little bit more sun. And they absolutely positively do need some sun, but they can manage to be shaded during the summer part of the day. And here are our guides. For every one of these plants, we're going to talk about the number of butterfly and moth caterpillar species fed by those plant leaves. And I'm getting these numbers from CalScape. Although that information is available at the general level at the National Wildlife Federation that Doug Taleny's group pulled together, CalScape now has that information for all of the California native plants. A bunch of our plants are long blooming. So many of us in San Francisco have got very small gardens. And so I want as much bang as I can get from a plant. So if I can get a longer blooming plant to continue to provide nectar and pollen in addition to leaves to feed my ecosystem, then I want to do that. I am obsessed with edible plants, and if you've heard my edible plant presentation, those little berries usually indicate berries. For this presentation, it's just going to mean that there's some part of that plant that's edible. It could be the leaves, the flowers, the seeds, the berries, the nuts, or the roots. A few of these plants, because they did evolve in a nice shady spot, are used to having a little bit more water than we usually think about for a drought-tolerant plant. There is a really weird acronym called WUCALS, the Water Use Classification of Landscape Systems, that the University of California came up with. And a drought-tolerant plant is either WUCALS low or very low. And if it needs damper soil, it's WUCALS medium. Willow, for instance, in the riparian area is considered WUCALS high. We're not going to get to anything that needs more water than a WUCALS medium, but a WUCALS medium is approximately as much water as a lawn would need. So let's talk some deep shade plants. They don't ever need any sun. They are understory plants and they are proud of it. Woodland Strawberry, so fun. I've got that as a ground cover. Okay, I'm a woman who has way too many ground covers. I have both of these. I have the Woodland Strawberry and Yerba Buena. Yerba Buena is a delicious, edible herb. So if you think, oh, I have this shady garden and I can't grow herbs and I want to grow herbs, grow Yerba Buena. You can grow herbs. It's wonderful. The leaves taste like a combination of oregano and a very light mint. It's a ground cover. It's fantastic. It loves shade. It does fine in clay. It does fine in sand. I've got it on clay. I've got the Woodland Strawberry on clay. It does not produce fruit unless there's been a really good rain year, but it will flower reliably in shade every year. And there are some deciduous ground covers. So if you've never tried one of our native violets, the Hookspur violet is a lot more drought tolerant than the yellow violet. It's a fantastic plant. We've got 6 federally endangered butterflies that all use the Hookspur violet as their larval plant. So please consider putting that in. The leaves are edible. Really, it's about the size of a dinner plate because really, I only really think about food. And it will go summer deciduous. The yellow violet, also the leaves are edible. It does need a little bit more water. So if you were going to put in a bioswale, that would be a great plant, but they need a lot of shade. They really prefer a lot of shade. Creeping snowberry, another great plant. Flowers in deep shade, fruits in deep shade. Don't eat that fruit. It's nasty, but it does fruit and it's pretty. And Pacific blackberry, it's a thorny plant. It is deciduous, so it's going to lose its leaves like everything in the raspberry family. One of the ways to tell a Pacific blackberry from the invasive Himalayan blackberry is that the Himalayan blackberry has got those extremely big thorns like a rose, and Pacific blackberry's got much, much smaller thorns. It is deciduous, it is thorny. I rarely recommend a thorny plant, but it is edible and it can take a lot of shade. These are a bunch of gorgeous, gorgeous flowers. So if you think, oh, I've got deep shade, I can't have any color. Yes, you can. Handstand is gorgeous. So it's not only that fantastic blue color, but it's long blooming, which is wonderful. And we've got bleeding heart and telema and meadowrue and columbine, all of which can bring a lot of sun, or a lot of color to your extremely shady garden. And we've got a bunch of ferns that do well in deep shade. We've got a couple that are drought tolerant, coastal wood fern and coffee fern, and a couple more that need a little bit more water, the western sword fern and the California polypody. And we've got some grasses that do well in deep shade. We've got a couple of horsetails, they need more water, and western ryegrass specifically can take quite a bit of shade. If you are thinking you've just got a very small garden, but you do have ground to put in a shrub, the pink flowering currant is one of the best things you could put in. It can take anywhere from deep shade to some sun. It's got edible fruit. It blooms for 3 months, December to February, and it's a very important early blooming plant. So your hummingbird would prefer to be able to live in your garden year round. And when you have a winter blooming plant, it makes it much, much easier for your hummingbird to survive. Snowberry is another great plant. We talked about the ground cover snowberry, the creeping snowberry before, and this is the snowberry shrub. Salal is a wonderful plant. I grew it twice in clay and then it keeled over and I thought, okay, it's on Mike Wood's San Francisco native plant list. I don't understand why it won't grow here. And it turns out it grows in sand. So if you've got sandy soil and a very shady garden, you can grow salal. It is delicious. I did try to grow it twice and that fruit is yummy and it keeled over in clay twice. So I'm not doing that again. But if you've got a sandy garden, you can grow it. Coffee berry is great. It can take anything from deep shade to quite a bit of sun. And it's evergreen, shiny leaves, a wonderful landscape plant. So medium shade, I talked about how this isn't a real thing in the landscape industry. I've just noticed that there are plants that even though they say they can take deep shade, they're gonna want a little bit of sun to be able to flower. So wake robin, I have not grown that yet. I want to. I've got a couple of hazelnuts that when they're a little bit bigger and can provide a little bit more shade, are gonna get some wake robins underneath. They're just gorgeous. And beach strawberry, I've heard, needs a little bit more sun. Woodland strawberry can take more shade than the beach strawberry. Beach strawberry needs to have sandy soil. So a lot of plants that have the word beach or dune or seaside in them often require sandy soil, and beach strawberry is one of those. Again, if you've got different experiences for any of these plants, please put that information in the Q&A, because so many of these plants like the beach strawberry, I can't grow. And if you've got a different experience, I want to make sure to be able to learn from it. It's the joy of having the California Native Plant Society community, is we can all learn from each other. We also have a barberry, the dwarf barberry. It's fantastic. It's evergreen leaves. They're a little bit spiky, and then that brilliant yellow flower, long blooming. It's another December to February bloom. Another favorite for early arriving bees and for those hummingbirds. And it's got very tart berries, but if you're a Sour Patch Kid kind of person, you may love this. They're very, very sour. They're very tart. They also have a lot of pectin, so they're going to be great in pies. Another couple of plants for those of you who really want to have an herb garden and have a very shady garden. Monkey flower savory likes a lot of shade. It also likes a little bit extra water. It's not quite from San Francisco. The San Francisco classic mint is coyote mint, but that thing wants a lot of sun. I have my coyote mint in partial sun and it hates life. It wants a lot more sun than that. Monkey flower savory can take a lot of shade. Just a tiny bit of sun to bloom. And hummingbird sage is our only native sage here in San Francisco. It's delicious. The leaves are almost fruity tasting, and all of the sages, if it says salvia in the Latin name, then it's a true sage, and all of the salvias have edible flowers, and those flowers taste like fruit punch. So it's a fantastic plant to have in the garden, and it needs quite a bit of shade, but it can take a little bit of sun to flower and then set seed. And then shooting star is just gorgeous. Needs a little bit more water, but a really pretty plant. Yarrow is a bulletproof plant. It grows from rhizomes, so it's pretty shallow rooted. It can take a lot of shade and a lot of sun. Really cute at night to watch insects fall asleep on it. Baby boy bees that have been kicked out of the hive will go snooze on a yarrow at the end of the day. It's just adorable. And they're a really long bloom, very drought tolerant. Bee plant, equally drought tolerant, can take a lot of shade. And little tiny red flowers, but really looks cute and the bees adore it. Coral bells, it's a very, very, it's a very sweet plant. Really cute in mass. Bees adore it and just easy to grow. All of these, if you've got a very dry garden with a lot of shade, these are 3 very easy to grow plants. And we've got a couple of vines that do well in shade, the California honeysuckle and the Dutchmans pipeline. And all of these support a certain number of butterfly and moth species. I want to call out the Dutchman's Pipeline. It's a oak woodland plant, which means it needs to be in a lot of shade. It will eventually crawl towards the sun. Soft leaves, but it's got to be planted in shade. Does fine in sand and in clay. Planted one in my mother-in-law's garden in the East Bay before anything could shade it, and it keeled right over. So don't plant it until you have someplace shady to put it in. It will be unhappy right away and it will die. And you want to have it because that spectacular butterfly, the pipevine swallowtail, this is the only larval plant floret, the only caterpillar plant. And it's just a gorgeous butterfly. It can fly a really long ways. It's just beautiful and you want to have it. So if you've got any space for a shady vine, do consider Dutchman's Pipeline. So we're back to more edible plants. All three of these are edible plants. They're all berry plants and they are all delicious. Salmonberry and thimbleberry are both in the raspberry family. Salmonberry really needs a lot of water. I've got it in 3 of my 4 seeps. I had it in quite a bit of shade and it would flower with a brilliant pink flower, but it wouldn't fruit. And it finally got tall enough that a few leaves got a little bit of sun and then it fruited. Like, oh, okay, I get it, because it was certainly getting plenty of water. Thimbleberry can take a very wide variety of sun and shade. I've seen it grow in sand in Golden Gate Park. It grows just fine in clay in my garden, but it does need to have a little bit of sun to be able to fruit. It'll flower without sun, but it won't fruit without sun. And the fruit is delicious. And it's way too soft to be able to find at a farmer's market. So you're gonna wanna grow that yourself. No thorns on the thimbleberry, so a very kid-friendly plant. Just gorgeous, easy to grow, fun. It will kind of run through your garden, but it will run around the other native plants, so it's fine. And huckleberry is wonderful. It can take a ton of shade. Mine gets just dappled sun for about 3 weeks right in the center of summer, and that's fine for 2 of them. I've got a third one that's in deep, deep shade, and it just won't flower or fruit. It's fine, it's growing, it's happy, but because it doesn't get any sun at all, it's just not as happy. So that's why I've got this weird medium shade thing. It does need just a tiny bit of sun to be able to flower and fruit. For the larger plants, we've got Malvarosa is gorgeous, stunning, long bloom, cream bush for those of you who are on sandy soil. Very showy white flowers, slight scent, and coast barberry is the taller version, evergreen, bright yellow flowers. We looked at the ground cover earlier. This is the taller version. It can take quite a bit of shade. It is going to want just a little bit of sun to be able to flower and fruit. And it can go anywhere from that little bit of sun to full sun. So it's a great plant to have. Again, it flowers December to February, so important for hummingbirds. So trees for medium shade. Blue elderberry, what a bulletproof plant. And birds love this plant. Between all of the different caterpillars that are using the leaves as larval plants, for the very, very shallow flowers where all the little tiny insects come, and then the tasty berries, the berries that both people like to eat and birds like to eat. Birds are there for the caterpillars, they're there for the tiny insects, they're there for the delicious berries. So it's a great plant to have in the landscape. Gets to 30 feet pretty quickly. Mine's about 12 years old and it's over 20 feet. You can prune it up so that it looks more like a classic tree with a trunk, but don't try to top it because it will laugh at you and then continue to grow towards 30 feet. Silk tassel, great plant, loves a sandy, loves sand and wind, so it needs to be within about a mile of the coast. If it doesn't get sand and fog and wind, it's not too happy. Beautiful plant though, just gorgeous. It looks like a Christmas tree. It's kind of got that triangular shape. It's as if a Christmas tree got into a plate of Christmas cookies, just a little bit wider towards the bottom. You could prune it up, but if you let it go ahead and have the leaves all the way down to the ground, it will be your wind barrier for all the plants behind it. And California hazelnut is delicious. You're going to need 2. It's going to be worth it. They do need just that tiny, tiny, tiny bit of sun at some point during the year, get to their leaves, and then you can get nuts from it. It's a wonderful plant. Light shade. So if you're putting in a brand new garden and you are eventually going to have some of these little 1 gallons turn into a 30-foot tree, then you might consider putting some things around it in other 1 gallon plants that will be fine when they're getting tons of sun, and that will also be fine when they're being shaded. And so that goes, checker bloom is wonderful, seaside daisy is wonderful, gumweed is wonderful, bush monkey flower. We've got a bunch of grasses, red fescue is great. Dogwood can take a little bit of shade. Toyon would prefer to get some sun, but it is part of the oak woodland. California wax myrtle and holly cherry can both take some sun, at least that's what, can take some shade, at least that's what I hear. And mugwort is one of the artemisias that can take some shade. So a lot of great plants on this list if what you're doing is everything's going to start out as a 1 gallon and then eventually some things will get tall. So what if you've got that north-facing balcony with some containers? What can you plant? So annuals are wonderful. They've got short little roots. They live fast. They die young. They're only going to be good for a year. And everything has to happen in a year. And so these are all of the California annuals that do well either in a lot of shade like miner's lettuce or some shade like the rest of these colorful plants. Farewell to spring comes in a lot of different colors. So when you get a seed packet, just expect to see a bunch of different colors in there. These are all really pretty plants, attractive to bees, and miner's lettuce is delicious. You can grow your own lettuce. If you're from another part of the country and you think you want to try to grow regular lettuce, please don't. Just get a package of miner's lettuce and put it on any kind of soil. It prefers the shade. It'll grow in sun, but it really, really, really prefers quite a bit of shade. And we've got a bunch of bulbs, corms, rhizomes. They're all underground parts, either something like the size of a pearl onion or something that looks like a little bit of a ginger root. But all of these mean that they've got very short underground parts so that you could stick them all in the equivalent of a takeout container with some holes in the bottom. You can put them in any kind of container and they'll all do really well. Blue dicks seem to be a favorite of butterflies. I don't really know why. I do want to warn you about Mariposa lilies. They are absolutely gorgeous, and I have met a number of people who simply have to have them all. Double check when you are looking at your Mariposa lilies. This particular one does well in shade, but not all of them do. Ethereal spear and elegant Brodiea both have edible roots or edible bulbs when they're cooked. But the thing I love about both of those plants is that they have edible flowers. And so that's a lot of fun to do. I can't bring myself to eat the bulb. I know I could, in theory, pick it out and cook it and eat it, but I'm just not going to. But I'm more than happy to eat some of those flowers. The iris and the blue-eyed grass, don't eat those. The iris is clearly in the iris family. The blue-eyed grass is also in the iris family. Iris family plants, don't eat those because those are bad for you. But they are very, very pretty and they do really well in a lot of shade. All of these bulbs and rhizomes and annuals do just fine in the ground for gardens, but if what you've got are containers, you've got a lot of choices. If what you've got is a shady north-facing balcony with containers. So let's take a look at the all-year buffet. We'll look at an edible native plant buffet for people, an adult butterfly buffet, a bee buffet, and a hummingbird buffet, keeping in mind that all of these buffets are applicable to feeding caterpillars that feed our ecosystem. So here's what a year of food in a native edible garden looks like. There are so many things that you can eat. It's delicious. and a year of food for that's attractive to adult butterflies. So adult butterflies can eat nectar from all kinds of plants. The nice thing about putting in the native plant is that, again, you've got those leaves that feed the caterpillars, and you've got the pollen that feeds the specialist bees. And for our bee buffet, we have all kinds of happy bees eating specialty pollen throughout the year. Hummingbirds, again, they want to stay in your garden year round. And the way to encourage them to do that is to make sure you have plants that are blooming throughout the year, especially December, January, and February. So manzanitas, barberries, and currants. I understand that if what you have is a shady garden, you can't grow manzanita. It will be a very unhappy plant if it's shaded. But you can grow most of the rest of these, and they'll do really well. So let's talk about garden resources. We can talk about plant lists and Cowscape and Cowflora and iNaturalist. So we've got a bunch of different plant lists on the Yerba Buena website under our biodiversity resources. We've got lists for edible plants and butterflies and hummingbirds and bees and long living in shade and color and plant communities and sidewalks and container plants. And that landscape design softscape is what I hear landscape designers call plants in a landscape. So take a look at those. We do have a new gardening for butterflies and a beautiful new gardening for birds, graphical flyers that were put out, and they're just gorgeous. Cowscape, if you haven't used it before, is California Native Plant Society of the State's way of helping you understand what each California native plant needs in terms of its growing conditions. So what is approximately native to your area? They do have a 10-mile radius. Keep in mind that 7 miles by 7 miles in San Francisco, we've got a ton of different microclimates due to all those different soils and fog and wind. So definitely if Cowscape suggests something, double check the soil needs. But for every plant you're interested in, it will tell you which butterflies it feeds and how big it gets and how much water it needs and what kind of soil it needs and which nurseries carry it. So it's a very useful tool. Cowflora is another wonderful tool. I really like their bloom period tool. So when I need to put a lot of plants into a small space, and so I want to get the most flowers year round for a landscape, I definitely go to Cowflora. It's very useful. And I use iNaturalist to help me figure out where certain native plants are. And so I'm going to take you through what I think is all of California Native Plant Society Yerba Buena's areas. Every one of those red dots is where some person on iNaturalist has taken a picture of one of our 500 different native plants, either in the wild or having been installed in someone's garden on purpose. So someone's container on a north-facing balcony, someone's home garden, someone's school garden. But you can take a look and see that it's not just the Presidio and Golden Gate Park and Grandview Park and Buena Vista Park that have got native plants. We've got them all over because we've got gardeners like you putting native plants in your garden and then taking pictures and putting that on iNaturalist so that we can all see who's able to grow what plants where. And we can see where those green spaces are that San Francisco Estuary Institute recommended that we have, and see all those green corridors between those spaces. And we can see that in San Francisco, and we can see it in San Bruno Mountain and along the coast. And we can see it as we go down into northern San Mateo County and look at all the good work that all of the people in CNPS are doing to plant native plants and to help us understand what's growing where. I realize at this point we're looking at some California Native Plant Society, Santa Clara Valley work as well. But all of these native plants and all of these observations help us understand what we have and what else will grow when we want to restore an area or add native plants to help our ecosystem thrive. So I want to say thank you to all of the people on my naturalist whose photos I used and all of the professionals whose data I used. And I want to thank you for all of you for planting native plants. So let's take some questions. Thank you for reminding me, Polypodium schooleri. I do not know that one. So let me take a note because that's fantastic. This is great. This is why it's wonderful to do this presentation. I've done this presentation for the San Francisco Public Library, but having California Native Plant Society people, this is great. Thank you. Carolyn, Dutchmans Pipeline, recommendations for shrubs or small trees to plant it with. Yes, it will grow well on anything. You can put it with, it depends if you're looking for a shrub, you can put it with one of the currants, the pink flowering currant. You can put it with the blue elderberry. You can just make sure it gets some shade. I mean, it's great with an oak, although that isn't exactly small. It's great with toyon. It just put it where it won't get any sun when it's little. And native fauna utilizing the Douglas iris hybrids. So I have seen my my hummingbirds like the Douglas iris. I've got the species and some of the hybrids. So I haven't had a problem with that. Does anybody else have some recommendations for some small shrubs for the Dutchman's Pipeline? You could put it on hazelnut. I do love hazelnut so much. I put in a vine maple because I didn't know any better. I knew it was a native maple. I just didn't realize it wasn't native here. And I was looking for a shorter maple, so that's what I've got it on. I've also got another Dutchman's Pipeline on a trellis, but it's not as happy. It really does prefer to be underneath a native plant. My mother-in-law's got it underneath a Fremont's bush mallow, Malacathamnus fremonti, and that's very effective. She's got it sort of there and on a trellis.
Susan, it might be fun to put it on a oroberry, or what's it called, Indian plum?
Oh,
Because it goes deciduous. Ossoberry, yeah, ossoberry, yeah.
Yeah, if you're on sand, I can't grow ossoberry.
So yeah, it'll lose its leaves and you'll still have the vine on it.
That's a great idea. Yeah, if you're on sand, you can do that.
Susan, we've seen it climbing up fences too, as well. The Dutchman's Pipeline.
Yeah, mine. I do have two, and it plus my mother-in-law, so that's three. And they just really prefer, at least the two that are near a native plant are much happier than the one that isn't. I have seen Mike Belcher, who's out near the 16th Avenue tile steps, and he's got it growing on trellises and it seems fine.
I think he trains it a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, so he works it like into the trellis. He also gives it 5 gallons of water about once a week to each plant. So
yeah, he does.
That helps make it robust.
Yeah, Carolyn's also mentioning Ossoberry is a heavier water plant user than a Dutchman's Pipeline. Dutchman's Pipeline is an interesting plant. It straddles, imagine being a creek running through an oak woodland. Dutchman's Pipeline is one of those plants that does seem to want more water the first 2 years of life. And then it will go drought tolerant, but if you gave it more water, it would be fine with that. So it's a little bit odd. But I haven't grown ossoberry myself because I I can't, I'm not on sand. But Bob, you might know more about that than I do.
Yeah, I've got some sand in my yard, and I don't provide it any extra water or anything. And Mike Belcher said the pipeline for him, he pours about 5 to 10 gallons of water on it a week.
For just the first couple of years.
Right.
Yeah, and then it's drought tolerant. I never did that for either of mine, and they're both fine. My mother-in-law doesn't do that for hers, fine also. We've got one out in a public space, West McCoundry Lane. We're giving it a little bit more babying than my early ones got, but still it's a public space, and it seems fine so far. Got a question about a ceanothus bush that it's going to get at most a few hours of sun, May to September. That's going to be a pretty miserable ceanothus. Ceanothus is just, boy, do they like full sun. I don't know if any of you know of any of the particular ceanothus species that might handle a bit more shade. It's manzanitas want full sun, ceanothus wants full sun, Fusilia wants full sun. We've got a bunch of chaparral and grassland species that just plain want full sun. What else do we have? Oh, Michelle. Michelle is down in San Mateo and is working outreach. Michelle, you've got such a good question. Is it best to plant in the fall? It's best to plant in the rainy season. I am a terrible gardener, which is why I refer to myself as only the easiest plants survive, because really only the easiest plants survive. And so I only plant November to February. Sometimes if it's been a really good rain year, I'll go into mid-March, but I just don't trust myself in terms of being able to keep things alive. There are better gardeners than me that can manage to plant throughout the year. And so I've been planting with some other gardeners in some public spaces, and we're having some varying success with having planted later in the year.
Well, hey, Susan, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. Really appreciate you showing it to us.
This is really fun. And we've got a shade plant graphical flyer on the website.
I think Bob shared that in the chat, and we've recorded this presentation. If anyone wants to come back and review later on, we'll have it on our YouTube within 3 or 4 days. And just really appreciate all your wonderful advocacy, Susan. It's makes a big difference knowing about all these fun plants to put in to try out.
There's a lot of pretty plants.
There's a lot of shade too. A lot of shade.
There's a lot of shade.
All those fences and tall buildings here in San Francisco, they make for a lot of shade.
Have indeed. And oh yeah, hedge nettle, the Stackus is a great flowering plant, and it does really well in shade, but boy, it needs a lot of water. Mine seems to only be happy near the willow, so it seems like a Wookall's high plant, and I kind of hesitate to recommend a Wookall's high plant. If you have a riparian area, we do have a riparian plant list on the website, and please take a look. There's a lot of great plants that need a lot of water, and hedge nettle is a wonderful one.
Have you tried clematis, the native clematis?
I have. It needs full sun.
Okay, but
There's
maybe once it gets up into the canopy of a tree, will it do okay?
I've only seen it once. That's my garden. It gets full sun, and so I would hesitate to. And there's 2 of them. One of them is much more drought tolerant than the other, and they both start with L, which means I can't remember which one is which. But Calscape is pretty clear that one of them is more drought tolerant than the other, and if not Calscape, then the Wookall system does. But it needs full sun in my experience. Has anybody else tried with clematis? Oh, Jeremy, different species of hedge nettle have different water requirements. Oh, wonderful. Jeremy, I'm going to check that out. I didn't know we had any Stackus that weren't blue calls high because it's a pretty plant. Oh man, summer drought tolerant. All right, I'm going to need to change that. Thank you. And Carolyn, you've got a Ceanothus maritima in part shade. Okay, let us know how that works, because oh, the Stackus is what's edible? There's no way Ceanothus is edible. Interesting. Okay, Stackus is edible. I would check the. Yeah, no, Carolyn, I have the same problem with with spell check. Yeah, I don't think the Stackus is edible. I thought I looked it up, but I can look it up again. I use the Daniel Mormon Native American Ethnobotany database to see what is and isn't. Oh, Todd, you've got Rosa californica. You're right. I didn't mention that. We are growing that in a public space and it hasn't died yet. Again, it's got a lot of thorns, and the rose hips are edible, but not extremely edible. How much shade can that take, Todd? Because that would be really useful to know. Thank you for mentioning it.
Yeah, you see it growing in coastal areas. It would be pretty cool to have a pipe vine on that, I think.
Oh, wow. That would be amazing.
We do have one out in the open on Sunset Boulevard that we planted. That's
Okay.
doing okay right now. So we'll track that and see how it goes with sun exposure. And I see them at Fort Funston a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, Todd, really good point. I tend not to advocate for thorny plants. Just the two rubus are about all I can advocate for, because those, as I don't happen to like thorns, but I'm glad you're calling me out on that, because it is a very pretty plant and it does have a very long bloom period.
And the rose hips look really nice in the winter when it's not flowering.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay. I think we're done.
Well, hey, thanks again. And y'all join us next on, I think it's November 11th, when we get to explore Mike Wood's research. And hope you all have a great fall. Thanks for joining. And thanks again, Suzanne. That was fun.
Bye.
Bye-bye.